Hey, welcome to Firescale Audiobooks. If you enjoy our audiobooks, please consider subscribing to the channel. Also, feel free to share your review in the comments section below.
Hearing his words, Emily grew pale as despair began to set in. She knew there should be a method of turning that keypad off from in here, but she didn't remember how. She hated herself for not paying closer attention when her parents explained the various features of this room. So far, Emily had been the pillar of strength in their situation, doing her best to try and protect Emma despite the fact that her sister was not the only one who had lost her parents. But now, the weight of despair pressed upon the young girl's shoulders as the refuge she personally brought them to was starting to crumble. Her eyes, once filled with determination, now started losing their color and defiant edge as she felt like curling up on the ground in the fetal position. She was just a 16-year-old girl, after all. Her parents had just died. She was running on fumes, and she simply didn't have the power to defend herself against a full-grown man like Liam. Not to mention those strange pillars he was conjuring. As despair crept into Emily's soul, she had completely forgotten she was still grasping Emma's hand. So far, the younger sister had still been stuck in her shocked haze, but in that instant, a shift occurred within Emma as her big sister's despair washed over her, and something primal awakened within. Without uttering a word, Emma's grip on Emily's hand tightened as her eyes cleared. Feeling the change next to her, Emily blinked for a moment before looking down at her little sister, who looked up at her with a reassuring smile, even as unshed tears still sparkled in her mismatched eyes. It was both a silent plea for protection and an unspoken promise that she would stand by her sister's side. Feeling the warmth of Emma's support and noticing how the girl had pulled herself together after the heavy shock in the living room, Emily felt hope spark within her once again. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath before crouching down and hugging her sister tightly while whispering in her ear, "Hold on, little Em. Even if it takes everything I have, I will keep you safe. Now and always." At those words, a powerful conviction to protect Emma, no matter the cost, filled Emily to the brim as she started thinking about how she could keep them both safe from Liam. She had no confidence in the security company showing up in time. While wrecking her brain for a solution, she thought back to those weird pillars that seemed to appear while they were being chased by Liam, and at the same time, having calmed down a little, she once again felt that strange power from earlier flowing through her veins. She had forgotten all about that powerful feeling she felt before, as her parents' sudden fate and Liam's actions had forced all other thoughts in the background. But now, she once again started exploring that feeling. She realized that she might not have been the only one to feel that power, and if Liam focused on it instead of her parents, then perhaps his apparent ability to make strange pillars appear out of nowhere had something to do with that power. And if that were so, then perhaps she could do the same and use it to protect them. Her mind went a mile a minute as she began connecting puzzle pieces and following the same instinct that Liam had before when she suddenly began waving her finger in the air like a lunatic. Naturally, she was drawing her own runic symbol through pure instinct, much like Liam had done earlier, except that hers was pitch black instead of earthen brown. It was at this moment that Liam finally found the correct code. Ominously, the door slid open under his triumphant laughter. "Prepare yourself, little kittens, here I come." When he entered the room, the first thing he noticed was Emily waving her finger in the air, much like what he had done earlier. But his power-addled mind naturally rejected the very idea that Emily might possess the same thing he did. Instead, he just smirked with ridicule. "What are you doing, little Emily? Trying to ward me off with some pretend curses? This is real life, Missy, and I'm here to claim my prize." But as Liam walked closer to the two sisters while Emma was simply hiding behind Emily and glaring at him, Emily suddenly stopped her movements. An excited smile adorned her face as she felt power coursing through her body. Liam somehow felt this. He didn't know how or why, but he could feel the same power he had radiating off of Emily, and it angered him to no end. How dare this little bitch use the same power as him? So he immediately summoned his power and anger, ready to strike Emily down for her transgression. Naturally, Emily tried to do the same, but Liam was much faster as he already had a little experience. Fortunately, nothing actually happened. Liam was no less confused about this than the sisters, as he could feel his power, but it somehow refused to do anything. But that was only natural. After all, Liam was clearly someone with an earthly affinity, and unfortunately for him, they were currently on the second floor, far away from the very substance he needed to fuel his attacks. He would need to become much more experienced before he could form attacks out of the dust in the air or create earth out of nothing. Emily saw his actions and went from scared to confused to elated as she noticed no pillar was coming. So instead, she pushed herself to the limit by scrounging and gathering every tiny scrap of power in her young body. He called upon the power of her mystic glyph without even considering the glyph's purpose. She was no more experienced than Liam was the first time he tried to use his power, but the difference was in the intention. Liam didn't want to hurt the girl, at least not in that way, and he also just wanted to scare them and thus used only a little bit of power. But Emily had every intention of hurting Liam as badly as she could, and she planned to use everything she had to do it. So when a pitch-black magic circle floated in front of her outstretched hand, the shadows in the room became darker, and tens of small floating black orbs appeared in the room. Then, under Emily's enraged roar, they all shot off in different directions. She naturally wanted them all to converge on Liam, but considering the amount she used, there were still plenty of bolts heading for the man. He desperately tried to dodge as many as he could, but under his horrified screams, he was still hit by two of them. One hit him on the left side of his chest, while the other hit straight on his crotch. The bolts seemed to have corrosive properties as Liam's clothes disappeared, and the flesh underneath began to melt away, causing Liam to scream in pain as he bolted out the door, desperate to find some way of stopping this stuff from corroding his flesh. When he was gone, Emily could only smile with relief before her eyes slowly started closing, and she fell into unconsciousness. No one noticed the crimson shadow pass behind her black eyes. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. After these events, time moved fast for the sisters. They did everything they could to survive in a now much harsher world. Emma seemed to have no power, unlike Emily and nearly every other human they came across, which naturally only heightened Emily's conviction to protect her sister. Eventually, Liam, who apparently survived his encounter with Emily's powers, gathered some men under him and constantly harassed the two sisters. Yet, he was still too scared to start another frontal confrontation. Still, it put a lot of pressure on Emily as she became more and more desperate for the power to protect her sister when, one day, Emma came to her with an ancient-looking book that she had apparently found somewhere in the antique section of their family's library. Inside were methods meant to increase a person's ability to absorb the etherium around them, and although most of these methods were unavailable due to missing abilities or items, the etherium infusion sigil required just a little effort and skill. Naturally, Emily was skeptical. After all, why would such a book appear here when this magic only recently appeared in the world? Still, she was desperate enough to try anything, and to her astonishment, it worked. When she sat in the middle of that circle, power seemed to flow inside her as easily as water cascading down a mountainside. From there, it was a short time before her power grew to such an extent that her fearsome reputation would keep everyone far away from the Ashcroft estate. Unfortunately, this was also the beginning of the end for the Emily of the past, as corruption started to rear its ugly head. After waking up from Emily's memories, Eric sighed, but kept his eyes closed as he took a moment to remember where he was. "How long was I out?" he asked Alora via their mental connection. The answer came immediately, "Just about an hour. You should open your eyes." Surprised by her sudden suggestion, but seeing no problem with it, he did so and found himself sitting cross-legged in the same place where he had entered Emily's memories, right across from the door to the study, where he had found Emma earlier. Only now, Emma was sitting in front of the door, dressed in the loose-fitting pants and shirt Eric had left her with, while her knees had been pulled up to her chest and her arms were wrapped around her legs. Her green and white mismatched eyes stared at him with a combination of gratitude and caution as her long, white hair cascaded down to the floor and framed her pretty, if malnourished, face. Seeing him open his eyes, Emma tensed up but otherwise remained silent and in the same place. Not particularly surprised by her presence, Eric ignored her for now as he looked around the shabby hallway of what he now knew to be the Ashcroft estate. Having seen what they looked like in the past, Eric had to admit to feeling a little sad at their current state. He returned his attention to Emma and simply said, "Hi." Emma looked at him for a moment longer, causing Eric to suspect she had become mute, either by injury or mental blocks. But then he heard a voice, hesitant and hoarse, as if it hadn't been used in a long time. Hello." They stared at each other for a moment longer before Emma suddenly lifted her finger and pointed to a spot next to Eric. He looked where she was pointing and noticed the still doll-eyed Emily standing there. At this point, his fury at this woman for how she had treated her sister had wholly changed to pity. All Emily was really guilty of was an overwhelming desire to protect her sister, leading to a rush to gain power, a power she did not properly understand. Without the proper knowledge or protection, her dark affinity had heavily eroded and twisted her mind. Combined with the ability to enslave others, her mindset became increasingly obsessed with the idea of control as a means to ensure absolute safety. While at first, this mindset would mostly be a justification for enslaving people to make them act as guards, it later transferred to Emma as a means of protection, as well, convinced that the only way to truly shield her from all harm was to limit her freedom. Emily struggled with the idea for a while, of course, but eventually, the corruption from her dark affinity was relentless. Initially, her desire to control Emma only involved ropes and chains, though eventually, Emily even tried to enslave Emma as well. However, fortunately for Emma, her big sister had been unable to do so for some reason, despite Emma's apparent lack of power. Eric heard Alora speak up in his mind. When she left that room, she was surprised and scared upon noticing Emily standing there. But when neither you nor Emily showed any reaction to her presence, despite Emily's open eyes, she eventually gained some courage and went to inspect her sister. Alora gave a mental shrug. Of course, she was confused by Emily's state, but couldn't discover anything or get Emily to react, so she eventually went to sit down across from you, probably waiting for you to wake up. Inwardly nodding at Alora's explanation, he looked back at Emma, who was staring at him with a questioning gaze. "You want to know why your sister is like that?" Seeing her nod, he explained, "A friend of mine has locked her mind away and is currently controlling her body. If you're worried about her, assuming the last few years haven't severely eroded your love for her, then you don't need to worry. Emily is fine." But suddenly thinking of her corrupted state, he backtracked a little as he looked thoughtful for a moment. "Well, maybe not fine, but alive anyway." Emma looked momentarily surprised as her still hoarse voice sounded again. "You know what happened?" Eric nodded. "Yeah, that same friend I just mentioned had to look through your sister's memories and share them with me." Emma started looking around before moving her gaze back to Eric with one eyebrow raised in a questioning gesture. Understanding her question, Eric curled his lips in a smile as he put his finger to his lips, secret for now. "Let's get to know each other a little better before you meet my partner." Emma pouted cutely, but then nodded to indicate she understood. They fell into silence for a few minutes as Eric thought about how best to make this girl trust him more when Emma suddenly started crying softly as she looked up at Emily. Eric looked a little surprised. "What's wrong?" She didn't answer immediately, but buried her face in her knees, still pulled up to her chest as she sat across from Eric. Eventually, her hoarse voice returned. "If you saw her memories, then you should know." She looked back up at Eric, her beautiful green and white eyes now stained with tears as her already hoarse voice cracked even more. "It was all my fault. I was the one that gave her that damn book. And that's when she started changing." Eric looked surprised. It seemed this girl already trusted him enough to bare her heart to him. Or perhaps it was just that he was the first person other than Emily she had seen in a long time, combined with the fact he already knew everything that happened. Eric wanted to comfort her, but he also knew that lying to her wouldn't help her overcome this. So he simply told the truth. "That's partly true." Emma seemed to perk up at those words as she intently stared at him. What do you mean partly true?" Eric explained. Everyone has affinities to specific concepts that they are born with. These affinities will determine many things, including the mystic glyphs they awaken on first contact with Ethereum or at age 10 if they already live in an Ethereum-rich environment. Frowning, he continued, however, these affinities also have the habit of producing an effect we call corruption, which can affect a person's personality if they're not careful during the process of expanding their reservoir. He thumbed towards the motionless woman beside him. Your sister has an affinity for darkness, which generally has an especially bad influence on a person's personality. Then, he smiled sadly, but since she had no knowledge of this or how to expand her reservoir safely, she would have ended up corrupted anyway. The book you gave her simply sped up the process. Emma opened and closed her mouth a few times as she looked at Eric with tears in her eyes. Is that really true? Eric smiled again. Yes, it is true. What happened to your sister is terrible, but it would have happened with or without your interference. Instinctually feeling like Eric was speaking the truth, tears of relief began to stream freely from Emma's beautiful, mismatched eyes as she had lived all this time believing that she had caused Emily's change. Because of her guilt, she never even tried to resist her sister, thinking this was what she deserved for destroying Emily. She had wanted to get the key to her collar and gain her freedom, but only so she could try to cure Emily, not because she wanted to escape. But if what this man said was true, then perhaps Emily would forgive her. This thought made a beautiful smile appear on her face, but when she looked at Emily again, she lost it just as fast, as the relief also quickly drained from her face. Regardless of who or what was to blame, the Emily she knew was still gone. With that thought, tears reappeared in her eyes as she looked back at Eric with hesitation. She wondered if this man might have a way to bring her sister back. How do you know all this? Having watched Emma's various expressions, Eric's lips were still pursed into a sad smile. That's another secret for now. He couldn't exactly go around revealing Alora's existence, or that he had spent the last 7 years in another world. Not exactly hearing the answer she wanted, Emma kept looking at him with hesitation. Even if he knew of a way, would he help her? Would he care? She didn't even know what this man was doing here yet. Seeing her hesitation, Eric spoke up with a reassuring smile. Just say whatever is on your mind. I won't bite. Then he smirked while a particular glint appeared in his eyes. Well, not usually anyway, as he recalled some interesting nightly adventures with Alora. At the same time, he heard a loud pervert in his head, making him chuckle. You're one to talk. Alora just snorted and stopped responding. So Eric refocused on Emma, who had started talking with tears in her eyes. Is it permanent? Is it permanent? A teary-eyed Emma had asked. Knowing what she was talking about, Eric nodded thoughtfully, appearing to Emma, as if he was thinking while actually wanting to discuss the matter with Alora. He started speaking through the mental connection between him and his little partner. Want to weigh in here, Alora? As expected, what he heard back was a lot of groaning and sighing about helping strangers again. Do you really want to help them? I agree their fate is pitiful, but is that our business? Eric wouldn't usually be so caring to a stranger, but this was a special case. He would have had to be made of stone to not be affected by their story. Well, that or be a lusty and wicked little fairy who danced on the line between sociopathy and mere selective empathy. He knew Alora was perfectly capable of feeling love and compassion. It was just carefully directed at a small group of people. And these two sisters were definitely not part of that group. Eric chuckled. Perhaps not, but if even you find their fates to be pitiful, isn't that worthy of some attention right there? Besides, even though we've only just returned to Earth, I know you've already made half a dozen plans on how best to make use of this situation. Eric's lips curled into a conspiratory smile. Surely we could use the help of these two sisters, especially when one of them has a darkness affinity? The response took a few moments to come, but eventually he heard a grumbling Alora respond. I could just enslave them both, you know. Eric's smile turned into a grin. Yeah, but you won't because that would be going against our deal of not enslaving innocents. And I know the last thing you'll do is break a deal with me. Another few groans and sighs later, She finally relented. Fine, but you owe me, and I want a covenant with that Emma girl to ensure she'll serve us in the future. Saying Eric owed her was pointless. If they actually kept track of all the times Alora had said that, their relationship would never be the way it is now. It was just a way for Alora to save some face. Eric grinned. He never doubted he'd be able to convince her, but it was still nice to succeed. Deal. A covenant is fine. I'm sure I can convince Emma of just about anything so long as it saves her sister. A covenant was essentially a magical contract made with a fairy cedar magic. It would bind both parties to the specifics of the deal and force them to obey it until the details are fulfilled or until they grow powerful enough to break free. He continued, So, what do we do about Emily? Sighing with reluctant acceptance, Alora began to explain. Well, I can somewhat cleanse Emily's soul myself, but I actually think there might be a better way, assuming I am right about this Emma girl. She then talked some more about Emily's condition and the method for restoring her before Eric focused back on an impatiently waiting Emma. Even though Eric's conversation with Alora was pretty extensive, it didn't actually take more than a minute or so, as mental communication was very fast. He lost his thoughtful expression and began talking. It is permanent. But seeing the adorable Emma immediately about to break down, he quickly clarified, at least normally it is. Emma naturally honed in on those words like a hawk. And normally? Eric smiled at the young Emma. A situation like your sister won't recover without outside influence, but it is possible. He turned serious. She'll never be completely the same, however. Her corruption will leave a permanent scar, and she'll always be a much darker person than she used to be. His expression softened a little. That said, it should be possible to bring her back to a point where she remembers how to act like a real sister. Think of it as the Emily you remember, but likely to be a lot more willing to hurt others and a lot less likely to care about strangers. Emma didn't care about any of that, however. All she wanted was her sister back. They could figure out the rest later. A sentiment she wasn't shy about uttering, but she'll be my sister again. Eric nodded but then smirked. I won't help for free, however, and I'll require your trust. Having expected something like that, Emma stared at him with determination, clearly ready to do whatever it took. I'll do whatever it takes. Eric curved his lips into a grin as he stood up. Good. You can start by getting up. She stood up, a little confused about what he wanted, but unwilling to back down. She staggered a little, however, as she was still weak. Eric held out his hand to stabilize her, but she quickly retreated from him, clearly still skittish. Eric raised an eyebrow at her behavior. I did just say something about trust, didn't I? I understand that you're still a little wary of me, but the first thing I will need you to do is grab my hand. So if you want me to help your sister, you'll have to get over it. After telling her what he needed from her, he kept standing there with his hand outstretched, waiting for Emma to take the next step. He naturally had the power to simply grab her, but that wouldn't help anyone. She needed to make this decision on her own. Emma kept looking at Eric for a moment longer, inwardly debating her next action. Although Eric didn't seem to be a bad person, she clearly understood he had his own goals and ambitions. Did she really want to get tangled up with this person? Perhaps she could simply try to work it out with Emily now that she has a little more information on the subject. But she quickly shook her head. She had just claimed she would do whatever it took, but now she was hesitating at the thought of simply holding his hand. She scolded herself inwardly for her lack of conviction. She couldn't really be blamed too harshly, though, as the last few years were tough on her and had severely eroded her mental resilience. With renewed determination, she stepped closer to Eric and grasped his hand. It looked a little comical, as Emma was a somewhat small girl whose growth had also been stunted a little due to malnourishment during her teenage years. Combined with Eric's generally oversized body, his hands were far larger than Emma's. But Eric wasn't bothered as he closed his large hand over her small one with his lips curled into a grin. The physical contact allowed Alora to check Emma quickly for what she already suspected was there. When she found what she was looking for, she informed Eric, letting him know that they could proceed as planned. Emma was getting a little anxious, as they had just been standing there, grasping each other's hands and staring into each other's eyes for a couple of seconds already. Still, She figured that perhaps this was a test of her conviction, so she kept standing there with a determined expression. Eventually, something changed, as some kind of dark green energy started coiling around Eric's arm as it crept closer to where their hands intersected. Emma got even more anxious. She didn't say anything, but instinctively tried to pull her hand back, which was obviously impossible, while it was firmly clasped by one of Eric's dinner plate-like hands. Seeing her behavior, Eric quickly comforted her. "Don't worry, it won't do anything without your permission." Hearing his words, she calmed down a little, but looked at him with a questioning gaze. Eric was starting to get the feeling this girl didn't really talk much when she could help it. At this point, the coiling energy had reached Eric's wrist and stopped there as Eric looked at Emma. "This magic will create a covenant between us. Think of it like a contract, except much more binding." While the contract would technically be formed between Emma and Alora, since it was Alora's magic doing the binding, Eric and Alora's close connection basically meant they would share any and all soul-related bindings, for better or worse. Somewhat getting the feeling she was about to make a deal with the devil, Emma gulped a little, but then asked, "What are the terms?" Eric explained, "In return for me and my partner helping you diminish the effects of corruption on Emily, you will serve us, non-sexually, for 10 years. Furthermore, you are not allowed to speak a word of me or my partner to anyone without our permission." Setting aside her gratitude for including the non-sexual part, she was slightly stunned at the rest. Since her knowledge of magic basically only came from fantasy books, she had expected him to take something from her, like years of her life or a part of her soul or something. But what could a powerless person like her possibly offer him during 10 years of service if it didn't include sex? Looking at Emma's confused face, Eric asked what was wrong. "You look confused about something. To speak up, whatever it is. Your life has been bad enough without entering any agreements you don't fully understand." Emma was grateful for his words and uttered her confusion with a little apprehension. "I just wonder what you could want from me. I have no powers like my sister, and I don't even have a powerful body. You could probably squish me into a cube with one hand." Realizing what she was confused about, Eric grinned at her with mirth. "Do you really believe you are powerless? 70% of the human race dies out, and everyone that survives displays magical powers, except you." Emma was stunned at his words. Did she really have power like her sister? But why did she never display anything then? Eric continued to grin at her confusion and shook the hand that was still clasping Emma's. "If you want to know more, make the deal. Since my partner and I need your service in the next 10 years, we'll obviously make sure you'll be as strong as possible." Emma opened and closed her mouth a few times, wanting to know more immediately, but eventually just decided to accept that answer. She wasn't done asking questions, however, as she now looked at her sister. "What about Emily? Say you get her back to some kind of normalcy. Will I then have to leave her to go with you?" Eric shrugged in response. "Perhaps, perhaps not. We have our plans for Emily. We'll see how she feels when we're done with her treatment. There's a good chance she'll simply follow you. But yes, there's also a chance you'll be forced apart." Not entirely happy with that answer, but realizing Eric also simply wasn't sure about what the future held regarding Emily, Emma decided to ask her last question. "You keep talking about your partner. When will I get to meet her? She seems like an important part of this deal." Eric couldn't help but smile when thinking of Alora. "She's very important to me, but not so much for our deal, as you'll mostly have to deal with me. If you want to meet her, you can, but only after you make the deal. Her existence must be kept a secret from the rest of the world for now, and the covenant will prevent you from talking about her." Eric's insides tickled as Alora sent him a mental kiss for his first words, making him chuckle. Since Emma had all her questions answered, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She was aware that she would be signing away the next 10 years of her life, but felt that the rewards were worth it. So when she opened her eyes, she accepted the offer. "Then I accept." As soon as she uttered those words, the dark green energy at Eric's wrist started moving again and, under Emma's nervous gaze, started enveloping both their hands. Then, a change occurred as the energy suddenly started gathering around the backside of their hands before seemingly being sucked into two vortexes, one on Eric's hand and the other on Emily's. When it was done, Emily felt like something inside her had changed, as if her entire being was suddenly weighed down a little. Additionally, a small mark appeared on the back of her hand in the form of a howling wolf head flanked by 2 fairy wings. As she inspected the mark with interest, she suddenly heard a woman's voice right next to her ear. "Like it? I designed it myself." Emma yelped and jumped half a meter back. What? In the place she just stood now floated a tiny, beautiful woman with wings, causing Emma to go slack-jawed. Alora giggled at her little prank before she flew in front of Emma's face, rested her left hand on her hips, and used her right hand to point at Emma's face. "Listen up. Eric may have a bleeding heart for you 2 sisters, but I don't. Serve us well, or you'll find out why no one wants to make enemies of the fairies." Having said her piece, she turned into a cloud of light specks and returned to the comfort of Eric's soul. Alora had no interest in dealing with the 2 sisters outside of pranks and sexual activities. Emma, who was still coming to terms with the fact tiny women with wings apparently existed, felt strangely intimidated by Alora's words, as if the woman spoke with the weight of magic itself. Eric laughed softly at Emma's reaction and said, "Meet my partner. Her name is Alora. Don't worry about her words too much. As I said, you'll mostly deal with me. Just try not to antagonize her, as she could be a little vindictive." Seeing Emma calm down a little, Eric decided it was time to get started. "Anyway, show me to the kitchen. I think we need to get some food in you before we talk about the next steps. You can also ask me any questions you have left." Emma just nodded and started leading them to the kitchen while asking some more questions, some of which Eric answered and others he didn't. For some of them, however, he simply didn't have clear answers, like how or why he ended up in the Ashcroft estate. After all, while Alora had a theory about how he ended up on Sol, that one was mostly reliant on coincidence, but this second teleportation certainly seemed to be more than that. Not only because of the chains involved, but also because he just happened to end up in front of the Ashcroft estate, just in time to help out Emily, who just so happened to have the rare darkness affinity and had a sister with equally rare circumstances. It was all a little too fantastical to be a mere coincidence. And yet, they had no idea what kind of being could possibly orchestrate all of this or why they would want to. While they knew the universe had plenty of powerful individuals, it would be impossible to pinpoint a single one who not only had the power to do all this, but also had the intent, all without identifying themselves. But then again, Earth itself was plenty mysterious in and of itself. Regardless, there was no point in thinking about questions with unknowable answers for now, so he focused on getting something to eat. When they arrived, Emma was surprised to find there wasn't any food stored, something which Eric quickly explained by telling her that Emily and her slaves relied mostly on the Ethereum in the air to sustain them. In fact, it was the same for everyone else in the world, which was also why Emma had had so little to eat lately, as no one was preparing food anymore. There were just not enough people like her who were still alive in this world, but didn't get many benefits from the Ethereum. Luckily for Emma, one of the features worked into Eric's armor was a few cubic meters of spatial storage, which held a few weeks' worth of food, including some other bits and pieces. Not eating was actually a little short-sighted, as the Ethereum used to replace the lack of food might have well been used for other things. But the people on Earth weren't currently concerned with long-term benefits, as short-term survival was often still a serious concern. He picked some particularly nutritious food, which would help him get back on her feet. As this was food from Sol, it was naturally saturated with magic, and thus provided even more health benefits to Emma. Emma and Eric prepared the food together, but Emma seemed to have no more questions and also preferred to remain silent. Whether that was because of trauma or simply her personality was uncertain. Regardless, working together like this allowed Emma's trust in Eric to grow a little more. After they had eaten something, Eric sent Emma to get some sleep, as it was getting late, and she still needed to recover a little more before they would get started on treating Emily and exploring Emma's own powers. Meanwhile, Eric didn't really need much sleep, so he decided to head for the study where Emma had been locked up and which held the Ethereum infusion sigil, thinking he might as well use it for his own purposes. When he arrived, Alora appeared in a sparkle of light specks. That girl really did a good job with this despite it being her first time doing anything remotely similar. Maybe she has talent in sigil craft. Eric smirked. Are you perhaps offering to teach her, Alora? He expected a dismissive response, but instead, she remained serious. You joke, but I think I actually might. Assuming she sticks around, that is. Eric was surprised. Apparently, Alora really was impressed with the sigil. Alora lost her serious expression and looked at Eric with delight. Anyway, it's time to add another bloodline. Eric was standing inside the gloomy study of the Ashcroft estate, while Alora was floating before him. He looked at her with surprise and a little apprehension. Really? I thought it would be a little longer still. Alora giggled at Eric's anxiousness. Oh, are you scared of a little pain, my beloved protector? Shaking himself out of his apprehension, he rolled his eyes. You're not the one who actually has to suffer. Surprisingly, that seemed to strike a chord with Alora, as she looked a little uncomfortable. I guess that's true. But is it really that bad? Eric shuddered a little. It feels like getting turned inside out while my organs go through a blender. He shook his head, but never mind that. I can handle it. Alora looked a little concerned at Eric, as she suddenly remembered the first time they had done this. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. A slightly younger-looking Eric sat cross-legged on the ground in a luxurious-looking room. He and Alora had left the Obsidian Enclave just a few days ago and were now in an expensive inn in a human city. He looked at the beautiful fairy he had recently gotten bonded to with surprise. Infusing a bloodline? What does that mean? Alora looked far too excited for her own good as she began to explain. It's my special talent. You didn't actually get to meet my father before we were kicked out of the Enclave, but he is my mother's enslaved protector and a blood dragon. Eric was surprised that, despite her casually mentioning his status as a slave, her face did show love when she talked about her father. He supposed it was just a culture thing, but he still couldn't imagine his own daughter talking about him like that, assuming he would ever have children. He shook himself free from his thoughts as Alora continued explaining. As you probably know, my mother likes experimenting and loves her family. She wanted me to be as strong as possible. So even though fairy genes are generally dominant in mixed children like myself, she ensured that I got as much from my father as possible since blood dragons are an exceedingly powerful face. She shrugged. Well, it didn't end up making my body or magic more powerful, but it did mutate my seed or magic a little by giving me the ability to combine bloodlines. Her face suddenly twisted with annoyance. It seemed to be a pretty useless ability. However, I could affect various weaker animals with it, but anything more powerful than that would just ignore my efforts. But her face quickly lit up again in a mixture of excitement and obsession. But then you appeared. You're the first species I encountered whose entire existence seems to be created for the express purpose of blending with other bloodlines. Eric got the impression that Alora had been obsessed with her ability for a long time, knowing she was unique but unable to find a way to make use of her uniqueness. Unable, that is, until she met Eric. Their meeting caused her desire for an equal partner to blend with her obsession to find a use for her ability, making her jump into this partnership without much forethought. Eric didn't mind, of course. It saved his life, after all. But he still wasn't sure how he thought about being little more than this woman's obsession. He would have to work hard if he wanted her feelings to change into something more. A little overwhelmed by her speech, and with his mind still half drowned in the events back on Earth, he was a little unsure how he was supposed to respond to her. So he just shrugged. Okay, so now what? Disappointed with his lack of enthusiasm, Alora sighed. I suppose I expected too much from you at this point. She shook her hands with a hint of frustration. Regardless, infusing your bloodline can't wait. After all, you can't casually reveal your racial status. And since your species seems to have a strange method of advancing in power, you can't form a mystic sigil. I mean, you don't even have an affinity. She pointed an index finger at him, almost accusingly, which means that, even with my interference, you still can't cast magic and pretend to be a human, despite what I told you when we met. She suddenly produced a vial filled with red liquid from somewhere. So, we need to get you a regular bloodline that will allow you to gain a real affinity and form a mystic sigil. Her green eyes shone with obsession. Can you see it now? You and I were made to find each other. Despite being a little unsure about all this, Eric was still a little timid and felt somewhat intimidated by the woman's intensity. He could even feel Alora's powerful emotions through their bond, making him feel like he didn't have the option of refusing this infusion. Alora naturally felt his apprehension, but her desire to try her ability on Eric was overpowering, causing her to ignore everything else. She continued, "What I have here is the blood of a powerful Reiju. The Reiju is a wolf-type species with a strong affinity for lightning. Since your species also seems to be derived from wolves, it should make things easier this first time." 1. As she took the blood from the vial and made it float in front of Eric, she adorned a crazed smile that one might assume was very much like the one Frankenstein must have had when he created his own monster. "So, are you ready?" Eric gulped, but nodded in the end. A few minutes later, he was squirming and screaming on the floor in pain, while Alora looked on with disappointment, thinking the person she had taken as her partner really should be more resistant to pain. Her disappointment was only interrupted by a thought about how she was glad this room was properly isolated, so no one would come to check in on them to question them about the screaming. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Back on Earth, Alora was feeling guilty as she thought of that day. Sure, she didn't enslave Eric, but she still could have treated him better. Despite her conviction to become true partners with Eric, it ultimately took her a while before she eventually warmed up to and fell in love with him. She suddenly wondered how their relationship had even reached this point despite her initial behavior. Did she even deserve his feelings? Confused by the sudden feelings of guilt and sadness he felt through their bond, Eric asked with his brows furrowed in concern, "What's wrong?" Alora smiled sadly and shook her head. "It's nothing. But are you sure you want to do this? I know I was enthusiastic in the past, but there are plenty of ways to grow stronger, and you already have the rage of bloodline." Eric smiled at her with love and confidence. "Thank you for your concern, Alora, but I'll be fine. I am much tougher now compared to back then." While she outwardly nodded, Alora still wanted to do more, which suddenly caused her to have an idea. But first, she had to get this infusion started. Eric only got more confused by the expression on Alora's face he had never seen before, but decided to talk to her about it later. He had to take a moment and prepare himself mentally for the infusion. Alora seemed to have shaken off her sadness as she produced 2 vials of red liquid with an excited smile. "Anyway, since the Reiju bloodline has now been thoroughly combined with your own, it's time to add a second. And this time you have choices." She pursed her lips. "Unfortunately, you're still not ready for the truly powerful bloodlines like those of dragons, but we'll get to those eventually." She had stored up quite a number of bloodlines, most of which had been given to her by her parents, and some of those bloodlines were quite powerful, but that also made it much more complex to combine with Eric's bloodline. She held up 1 vial. "This has the bloodline of a powerful winter wolf. Since it is also a creature of the wolf type, it will be easy to combine with yours. It will boost all aspects of your body, while also giving you an affinity with ice, eventually allowing you to fuse it with your lightning affinity to create something more powerful than either." She held up the other vial but looked a little more concerned this time. "This has the bloodline of an old Bakanico, rather than a wolf. This creature is feline in origin. The incompatibility with your wolf type will make things more painful for you." She sighed reluctantly. "On the other hand, it will give you a boost in agility and speed, which you are lacking right now when compared to your strength and vitality. Furthermore, the Bakanico have a close affinity with shadow, which gets more powerful with age, and this comes from a particularly old Bakanico." Alora shook her head. "I'm personally more concerned with the pain you'll have to go through, but the corruption will be fine. With me in your soul, corruption will always have little effect on you. Besides, this sigil is crude and a little faulty. With some adjustments, using it will be much safer." Eric lost himself in thought for a moment. To be honest, the idea of mixing his bloodline with that of a feline creature was not particularly appealing to him. Not to mention that he enjoyed the idea of gaining ice as an affinity. Having lived in the frozen tundra of northern Norway for most of his life, he had always felt a close connection to the cold. Still, He recognized the need for an increase in speed and agility, as he could often be quite bulky in a fight. He looked at Alora with a power-hungry smirk. "Can't I just get them both?" Alora rolled her eyes at him as she felt like giving him a smack on the head if she wasn't holding those vials. "Since when did you turn into such a masochist? No, you can't get them both." Then, gaining a thoughtful expression, she backtracked a little. "Well, not right now anyway. I still believe you should get both of these eventually, but we need to wait until you properly blend with one before we start on the other." Then she smiled reassuringly. "Don't worry, though. It won't take 7 years again, as we're both more powerful now. Especially the Winter Wolf bloodline should be done in a year or so." Eric laughed lightly. All right. So, I'm sure you have a recommendation." But Alora shook her head. "I really don't. Do you know how many bloodlines I have stored? Close to 100. These two are already my recommendations out of all of those." Most of those bloodlines would never be introduced into Eric's body, some because they were simply too incompatible, but for the most part, it was simply impossible to blend that many bloodlines into one being. Eric nodded and started thinking again. He knew the fused affinity of ice lightning, or thunder snow, was powerful and rare, but the shadow affinity was extremely versatile and useful. Plus, shadow would be available immediately, but for thunder snow, he would have to combine ice and lightning first. Not to mention that Alora was right, he could use the extra speed that the Bakaniko bloodline would give him. Basically, it come down to strong future benefits and low current benefits, or mediocre benefits across the board. But when he realized that, it didn't take him long to come to a decision. He wasn't planning on fighting anyone particularly powerful for now, and while he wasn't arrogant enough to believe no one on Earth could defeat him, he wasn't planning on seeking out the most powerful people here, either. At least, not yet. So, he nodded. "All right, let's do Winter Wolf. Since it will take a shorter time to infuse, and I'll need some time to combine ice and lightning anyway, it's probably best if we start with that." Alora nodded, and, while she stowed away one of the vials, sighed a little in relief for some reason. Perhaps because he chose the less painful option? Eric didn't know, but it only made him more sure of having picked the Winter Wolf. She then drained the other vial into the air and made the blood inside float before the sitting Eric. "Are you ready?" Although she said the same words as back on Soul, they were spoken with much more concern and less enthusiasm this time. Eric smiled reassuringly at her and nodded, which made Alora feel a little better as she took a deep breath and guided the blood into Eric's body through his pores. Afterwards, she swiftly expanded back in her larger form and settled in front of Eric. She snapped her fingers and caused a shimmering bubble to appear around them, which would keep out the sounds of screaming so as not to wake Emma. Not out of concern, of course, but simply because she knew Emma needed her sleep for her awakening tomorrow. When she was done, she took another deep breath and made some blood-red magic circles appear in front of her that started floating around Eric before they started turning, as if attuning themselves to something. As Eric sat on the cold floor with blood-red sigils around him, attempting to make him more than he was, his body began to subtly convulse in agony as his insides were being broken down and reshaped to be compatible with the Winter Wolf bloodline. Eric slowly began to groan, first softly, then louder, as he clearly tried to keep himself still and endure the pain in an unconscious effort not to disappoint the woman he loved with his screams. He clenched his teeth, tightly shut his eyes, balled his fist, and tensed every muscle in his body as he fought the torment while beads of sweat appeared on his forehead. It was only a few seconds into his ordeal when he felt a small hand press against his chest and the soft voice of Alora in his ear. "Don't suppress it, my love. Let all out, and let me try to lighten your load a little." Eric suddenly felt the pain lessen a little as the hand on his chest began to tremble. He heard a small yelp in front of him before it transitioned into a high-pitched groaning. He forced his eyes open and saw Alora hunched over him with her hand on his chest and her face in front of his while she had her eyes tightly closed. Her whole body was lightly shaking, causing Eric to quickly speak with a strained voice. "What are you doing, Alora?" Alora lightly smiled, even as her voice came out shaky. I I'm taking some of your pain through our bond. A small tear escaped from her eye. I'm sorry I can't take more than this, but I'm afraid might faint, and the infusion will fail. Instead of feeling thankful, Eric felt anger instead. As he spoke through his clenched teeth, idiot girl. We both have our jobs. This is mine. But Alora shook her head. No, we are partners, and I'll share this with you, too. You can't stop me. She was right. He had no idea how she was even doing this, let alone how to stop her. So instead, he groaned through the pain. Jay, just you wait. When this is over, we're having a conversation about this. Alora smiled lightly in acceptance. But the pain was only getting worse, as it didn't take long before they both started to let out their pain in screams in a concert of pain. Eventually, Alora collapsed onto Eric's chest, where he wrapped his arms around her in an effort to comfort her. But as the pain kept getting worse, Alora did something unexpected. She snapped her fingers and made both Eric's armor and her clothes disappear. Eric was naturally flaccid as could be, but a little seed of magic perked him right up while also quickly preparing Alora as she sheathed him inside her. She wrapped her arms around Eric's neck and her legs around his waist as she slowly started moving whilst whispering in his ear, Sex is an acceptable form of pain relief. Let me comfort you. Eric actually felt himself relax, and the pain diminished even more as endorphins slowly began being released from the soft embrace of his partner and lover. They tightened their arms around each other as they moved slowly through their shared pain, while the blood-red sigils kept turning, slowly mixing Eric's bloodline with that of a winter wolf. It took 15 minutes for the process to complete, at which point all the pain suddenly disappeared, and the couple collapsed onto the ground, finally being able to let their bodies relax. They panted as they lay naked in a pool of their own sweat, with Eric still sheathed inside Alora, though neither of them had any interest in continuing with Alora's improvised pain relief method. Alora spoke through her panting, I can't believe that was only a small part of the pain you felt. I felt like I was going to die. Eric chuckled, even as he panted, and could barely keep his eyes open from exhaustion. It's just a difference of perspective. I don't doubt you could take that pain too with some training. Alora giggled as her voice slowly trailed off. I think I will take your word on that. I'm not sure I'm interested in pain training. Eric smiled suggestively. Are you sure? You seem to enjoy it when I spank you. But Alora didn't hear his last words, as she had already drifted off to sleep, while Eric followed soon after. Eric stirred as he started coming to his senses, and the memories of last night came flooding back. He looked at the still sleeping Alora and shook his head. This girl was really too much. He realized he was lying on the ground with a normal-sized Alora on his chest, and his now flaccid member still lodged inside her. As he started to move, he could feel every joint and muscle in his body ache as if they had gone through tremendous strain the day before, which was not far from the truth. When Emma saw this scene, she flushed red, but immediately shook her head as she apparently had other things on her mind. She sprinted closer to Eric and started fidgeting nervously. Finally, I found you. That man is back. Please get up. Among the questions Emma had asked Eric the day before, she had also asked him about the circumstances of his arrival, something Eric had obviously seen in Emily's memories. So they were both aware Liam had been there to represent the newly formed council with a small force of what they assumed were some kind of enforcers for this council, although he had obviously left out the part about being teleported there. Eric yawned deeply, still lying on the ground, as he started caressing Alora's back in an effort to wake her up slowly. He looked at the panicking girl. Calm down, Emma. We'll be fine. As he took a good look at Emma, he suddenly noticed that she possibly looked even worse than yesterday. He frowned. Why do you look so terrible? Did you get any sleep last night? Emma suddenly looked uncomfortable. Never mind about that. What are we going to about that man? Deciding that he could deal with Emma's issue later, he nodded groggily. Well, why don't you tell me what the situation is now? Emma quickly responded. Emily's guards are behaving on autopilot and have lined up in front of the door, but they are outnumbered. Currently, Liam and his cronies haven't attacked yet, but they are demanding for Emily to come out. Suddenly, Emma looked a little unsure, although I get the feeling Liam isn't in charge anymore. It seems to be some woman, and I think I might recognize her, but I don't remember from where. Eric yawned again. All right, I get it. Just give me a moment here. Annoyed at his casual attitude, but still a little too timid to call him out on it. She just stood there fidgeting, afraid of what might happen if she ended up in Liam's hands, the events from 7 years ago still clear in her mind. Eric groaned through his pained body as he sat up with Alora in his arms before he kissed her and whispered that she needed to wake up. Alora groaned, but eventually opened her eyes and looked at Eric with annoyance. My body hurts. Eric couldn't help but grin at her words. Well, I believe that was your own choice, was it not? Then he grabbed her chin and made her look in his eyes while saying sternly, Listen, Alora, I know your heart was in the right place, but never do something like that again, all right? His voice was full of determination as he continued. We both have our parts to play in this partnership, and my job is to keep you safe from physical harm. That is my pride as your protector, your conqueror, your partner, and your man. Don't step on my pride, Alora. His dominant attitude made Alora feel a little giddy, especially as she still felt Eric inside of her, but she realized now wasn't the time. She could see Eric was truly hurt by her actions, so she could only nod and say, All right, Eric, I won't do it again, but I'm still happy I did it. She cupped his cheek with her hand and smiled. I wanted to know what you had to go through to be as powerful as possible so you can keep us both safe. Lifting her hand seemed to have taken all her energy as she then made it fall back down before she whimpered. Anyway, go take care of the trash. I'll be happy to relieve myself of this body for a while. With those words, she disappeared into a cloud of light specks that got absorbed into Eric's body. He felt a strange combination of increased power and pain as his body seemed to ache even more now. But he certainly couldn't let that show after the words he had just said. Meanwhile, Emma didn't actually understand anything of what was said since her new guest spoke in Silvari, but she was horrified upon seeing the large snake flop freely onto the ground now that the cave it was previously sealed inside had disappeared. She yelped, blushed, and covered her eyes before starting to kick Eric in frustration at his behavior, seemingly having lost some of her timidity. Eric naturally just felt as if someone was caressing him and only laughed at her actions. All right, I'm going already. He stood up as his body creaked and ached before he stretched his large and powerful body right in front of Emma. Emma couldn't help but sneak a peek between her fingers as she felt intimidated but also somewhat comforted by his immense size. Since her trust in him had begun to grow exponentially from the moment he saved her and promised to cure her sister, she had already started to think of him as a giant boulder protecting her from the winds and rain of life. After a few moments of stretching, Eric finally felt like his body was his own again before he picked up his armor from the ground and put it back on under Emma's half-relieved, half-disappointed stare. He turned to Emma. Wait here, all right? Seeing the girl nod nervously, Eric walked into the hallway and heard a still tired-sounding Alora in his head. Remember, if you end up fighting, either use purely your powers as a werewolf or as a human. It's still too early to reveal. You could do both. Should I send Emily with you? But Eric shook. No need for that. I should be fine on my own, even if it comes to a fight. Besides, it would raise too many questions if she appeared in her puppet-like state. Feeling a mental nod to indicate Alora understood, Eric kept walking and suddenly started to wave his finger around in the air. Since he might soon get into a fight, he should be as prepared as possible, and he just got a new affinity to make use of. The aggressors appear to have found some reinforcements, as their group had only gotten larger despite the losses they suffered yesterday. While the cloudy sky made sure it still wasn't very bright out, the dark and oppressive atmosphere that Emily spread last time was nowhere to be found, for the simple reason that the woman herself was missing as well. Emily's absence caused a tenseness in the air as everyone stared at the woman's slaves with some anxiety, wondering when the slave mistress would make an appearance, while somewhat confused about why they hadn't simply attacked yet. Didn't the altercation from the day before warrant an all-out attack without the need for more negotiations? What most of them were unaware of was that yesterday's attack was not supposed to have happened yet. The council was sending someone from its joint security force, the Shadow Sentinels, to take charge of the operation. Yet, in an effort to claim at least one of the sisters for himself, while also hoping to gain some fame by taking down the infamous Witch of London. Liam had taken matters into his own hands by using his authority as a local warlord to call the attack early. The position of local warlord was granted by the council to various individuals who controlled certain regions before the council formation. After the formation of the council, various factions had formed within it, representing vampires, werewolves, and humans, and the European regions were divided among these factions. The human faction currently ruled England, and since Liam had already taken control of most of London during the 6 years before the council formation, he was given the title of local warlord and now ruled the local area in the council's name. Unfortunately, that title was now in danger as he stood beside a tall, pale woman named Seraphina Nightshade. This intimidating woman held the title of warden while serving the Shadow Sentinels. Wardens were the keepers of the peace and would be sent out whenever threats arose that local leaders weren't able to deal with. This woman was the person originally sent by the council to deal with the Witch of London, and she was very displeased by Liam's actions. Her short, midnight black hair framed a beautiful but angular face, complementing her bright crimson eyes. This actually made her appear similar to Emily, who also had black hair and crimson eyes. But unlike Emily, whose eyes were a result of her corruption, this woman was, in fact, a vampire. Oftentimes, that meant a warden sent to deal with the territory's issues would not be of the same race as the faction in control of that territory. And so was the case with Seraphina. Or so the people there thought, unaware that Seraphina had her own reasons for being here and had, in fact, called in some favors to make it happen. Seraphina was dressed in tight black clothes that clung to her curvaceous body as she exuded a sense of power and confidence. Yet, beneath there was an almost undetectable layer of anxiety for reasons only known to her. Her stance and attire showed a subtle elegance beneath her fierce exterior, and on her back was strapped a large sword that seemed to be almost as long and wide as she was. She stared at the array of slaves in front of her with a fierce, burning gaze, waiting for their enslaver to step forward and confront her as she thought about how to handle the situation. Unfortunately, her thoughts were interrupted by the annoying voice of a certain toad-like human being she was coming to loathe more and more. "Warden Seraphina," the toad said, "isn't it about time we attack? Clearly Emily intends to stay holed up in there after we almost got her yesterday." His voice was laced with carefully hidden contempt, as Liam firmly believed in letting humans deal with human issues. Why the council thought it necessary to send a filthy bloodsucker of all things to undermine his authority was beyond him. She hissed through her teeth, still seething in anger at this man's actions. "Silence, you worm. You have already royally fucked up with your actions, and you should be happy if the council decides to let you keep your position." With a wave of her hand, she dismissed him. "Now, be quiet and follow my orders. You don't want to give me a justifiable reason to chop off your pathetic little head." Liam grimaced at her words, but ultimately backed down. He knew this woman had both the power and authority to follow through on her words, and he had no interest in testing her. After all, while his ethereal reservoir was as large as anyone's, he still only possessed a single mystic glyph, making him a first ranker. But a warden needed to be at least a second glyph human or second rune vampire or shapeshifter, making them second rankers. But was he really supposed to just give up on Emma and Emily just like this, when he had worked so hard to get them before? Yes, he was. He knew he had no other choice. Liam had long since come down from the absolute arrogance he felt when he first came into this power, and he was no idiot either. Otherwise, he wouldn't have reached the position he was now in. Part of this change was due to the positive influences of Earth affinity corruption, making him more grounded and less prone to hasty actions, even if it didn't change his less than virtuous nature. Yesterday wasn't a lapse in judgment either. He had thoroughly prepared and made sure to have enough people to overwhelm the enslaved offenders. But unfortunately, Emily turned out to have some kind of weird time-stopping power, which he didn't anticipate. As Liam stewed in his own thoughts, and Seraphina kept staring at the Ashcroft mansion with unwavering determination, the front door suddenly opened, and someone stepped out. But it wasn't the person they were all expecting. Instead, it turned out to be a man. A very tall and intimidating man in obsidian black armor, with a large two-handed warhammer resting on his shoulder, held in place by Eric's wrist, casually resting on a shaft. His handsome face was framed by gray-white hair, fierce, amber eyes, and a casual grin on his face as he looked out over the various people gathered there. He naturally recognized Serafina as being both the person in charge and a vampire. But he had no real problem with that, despite the various vampire shapeshifter feuds his parents had told him of. After all, vampires had never done anything to him, unlike humans. In fact, there was another reason he didn't mind vampires, but he didn't like to think about that. Naturally, on his shoulder was not the warhammer he left behind on Sol, but it was a much weaker backup weapon he had stored in his armor storage space. Everyone was surprised to see a man suddenly appear there, because his eyes were clear and didn't seem enslaved. Especially Liam and Serafina looked at Eric with surprise and immediate hostility, though for very different reasons. Eric stepped forward and down the porch, where the gathered slaves of Emily opened a path for him, ordered to do so by Elora through Emily. Seeing the slaves behave this way made everyone even more suspicious and concerned about Eric's presence. Some even questioned whether the Witch of London had always been a guy. After all, not many people had seen her without her veil of darkness. When he arrived in front of the gathered people, he spread his hands with a broad smile as if inviting them all in and said, "What a lovely gathering. May I ask what you are all doing on my wife's estate? I'm afraid we haven't prepared to accommodate so many people." The people gathered before him reacted with shocked gazes at his apparent claim to being Emily's husband. Liam was about to lash out at him, but Serafina was faster, and she didn't believe for a second this man was who he claimed to be. "You think you're funny? Who the hell are you, and where is Emily?" With a slight smirk, Eric shrugged and said, "We all need to do what we can to keep the world entertained. These are harsh times, you know. People could die for simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time." Serafina narrowed her eyes at that clear threat, especially because she could feel the power brimming inside Eric's body. This man was no weaker than her, and perhaps even stronger. Still, she wouldn't back down so easily. "You're pretty cocky for a man who is outnumbered." As Eric's confident grin appeared once again, he responded, "What use is numbers before true power?" He pointed behind him with his thumb. "Those slaves just need to keep the trash busy while I deal with you. After that, it's just a matter of cleaning up the aftermath." Serafina couldn't deny that he was right. After all, she, too, could deal with this group of people on her own. Not easily, perhaps, but she would manage. That was just the difference between first and second rankers. The only reason Emily, who also has 2 glyphs, had any trouble with these people was because of her fragile state of mind, and because her second glyph was focused on control rather than combat. Liam, however, didn't see it that way as he scoffed loudly. "Absolute rubbish. You think you can so easily deal with a Sentinel Warden?" Since he had screwed up big time with this woman and had essentially given up on obtaining either of the Ashcroft sisters, he was now attempting to score some brownie points with Serafina in the hope of getting leniency, regardless of his feelings towards vampires. Besides, whether or not his words about being Emily's husband were true, he was clearly a free man who came out of the Ashcroft estate. That was enough for him to consider the sisters defiled, as he would never know what they had gotten up to in there. Serafina smirked at Liam's words, not because she felt flattered, but because she wanted to see how Eric would respond. Panning his gaze towards the short, pasty-looking man Eric recognized from Emily's memories, his eyes became filled with contempt for this snake. He knew he and Elora were no saints, but they had their limits. Or at least Eric did, but he acted as a limiter for Elora. He felt like simply charging the guy, but since he had refused the Bakaniko bloodline earlier, he wasn't sure if his speed and agility were high enough to get past this vampire. Luckily, a certain fairy suddenly whispered a much better idea into his mind's ear. Elora's plan caused him to smirk as he returned his gaze towards Serafina. "How about a deal? After all, while I don't particularly care one way or the other, I'm sure you'd much prefer it if things didn't come to bloodshed. We may both be confident in our victory, But regardless of who wins, your side will lose the most. That was true. After all those slaves technically belonged to her side. Serafina saw the look Eric had given Liam and wondered what that was about, but decided to hear his proposal first. So she narrowed her eyes. What do you suggest then? Without losing his smirk, Eric explained, I don't actually care about those slaves. I don't mind freeing them and handing them over to you, but I want something in return. Serafina raised her eyebrows at that proposal. You have the authority to do that? What about Emily? Eric shook his head. Don't worry about her. You're dealing with me now. In response, Eric panned his gaze towards Liam with a contemptuous grin. I want that pasty little shit over there. Liam immediately recoiled. What? I'm not going anywhere with you, you shitty pretender. How do we even know you speak the truth? Before Eric could respond to Liam's words, Serafina grabbed the man by his hair and tossed him on the ground before she stepped on his head in an effort to keep him silent. Shut up and let the grown-ups talk. Liam seethed in humiliation and anger at being disrespected like this in his own territory, in front of his own men. But he could do nothing, as Serafina's foot was unyielding. Having dealt with Liam, Serafina panned her gaze back to Eric with a look that showed some surprise, but also a bit of interest, despite her words of refusal. Although I don't like the man, I can't just hand him over to you. He is still a warlord serving the council. Eric shrugged. I have no more idea about what a sentinel warden is than what a warlord is in your council, and I really don't care. If you want the slaves without bloodshed, you'll have to trade him. Serafina and Eric stared at each other for a few moments, but when neither of them gave in, Serafina decided to change the topic, setting aside the issue of Liam for now. About Emily and her sister. She narrowed her eyes a little. Liam was right about one thing. We have no idea if you can actually do what you promised. Not to mention that I intend to take her with me when I leave here, as the council wants to make an example out of her. But Eric waved his hand in dismissal. Neither Emily nor Emma is going anywhere. That is non-negotiable. As for proof that I can do what I promised. He snapped his fingers, and one of the slaves came forward before suddenly collapsing in front of Serafina. Serafina completely ignored the collapsed slave and focused on Eric's first words instead. You seem awfully insistent on keeping the sisters here. Exactly what is your relationship with them? Are they your allies or your prisoners? And her voice seemed to get imperceptibly more hostile at these words. Are they already dead? Eric raised his eyebrows as he noticed her hostility and decided to turn her question back on the woman. You seem awfully interested in their fate. Exactly what is your relationship with the sisters? Still not getting the answer she wanted, Serafina growled. None of your business. Eric laughed softly at her refusal to answer. Well then, right back at you. I'm afraid the sisters' fates will remain a mystery for now. Meanwhile, the collapsed slave seemed to be coming to, as he stood up with a confused expression but clear eyes, obviously having been released from slavery by Elora through Emily. Serafina noted that Eric had spoken the truth, but otherwise ignored the freed slave, as she simply signaled one of the people behind her to check the man. Yet despite the provided proof, they seemed to be reaching an insurmountable impasse in their negotiations, so Eric offered a different solution. Listen, he started amicably. Although I don't particularly mind if today ends in bloodshed, I have no interest in a longer-lasting conflict that would likely result from a bloodbath. So how about this? He proposed. Since any conflict between our two groups would likely be decided by the battle between the two of us anyway, we might as well skip right to it and have a duel. The winner decides how this ends, and you'll have a valid excuse to give your counsel if I win. Then he smirked a little. Plus, I'll still let you have the slaves either way. This option seemed to interest Serafina. While she could feel the power in Eric's body, it didn't feel as overwhelming as that of her father or the other council members and faction leaders, so she believed herself capable of victory. And since the council intended to use the rescue of these slaves as propaganda material, saving them was supposed to be one of her highest priorities. She seemed to mull his proposal over as she opened her mouth to ask a question. Can I assume from your words that you intend for this fight to be non-lethal? Eric shrugged. I figure killing you would cause more problems than it solves. But if you prefer it to be to the death, then I don't mind that either. Seraphina snorted. Since I can't kill you before you actually release these slaves and tell me where Emily is, non-lethal is fine. Smiling at her apparent acceptance, Eric extended his hand. So, does that mean you agree? Seraphina nodded and extended her hand. Fine. Eric laughed deeply as she accepted, looking forward to fighting against a worthy enemy. Over the last 7 years of nearly constant fighting, he had learned to find enjoyment in it, and now couldn't wait to fight stronger and stronger opponents. Having agreed on a duel, Seraphina knocked Liam unconscious with a quick kick to the head to make sure he didn't go anywhere and assigned one of the people behind her to watch over him. Since he was part of the wager, she naturally had to assume responsibility for his continued presence. Neither of them saw any point in dragging this out, so they decided to simply do this here and now as they moved to a better spot and ordered the various bystanders to take a few steps back. They now stood across from each other in a large, grass-filled, open space on the Ashcroft estate. Seraphina held her large sword in front of her as if it weighed nothing, while Eric had planted his hammer on the ground as he looked at Seraphina and couldn't help but admire the beauty and elegance by which she moved despite her large weapon. Seraphina eyed her opponent. I'm surprised by your heavy armor and weapon. No one really uses armor, and most humans don't use weapons at all, let alone such a large hammer. While Eric quite obviously was not a vampire, she had also discarded the possibility of him being a shapeshifter, since he couldn't possibly shapeshift while inside that sturdy-looking armor. The truth was very different, but she had no way of knowing that. While that was why shapeshifters didn't use any armor, most others didn't bother with it, either since no one had figured out how to create something that could hold up against even mere rank 1 fighters. Even weapons needed to be regularly maintained, and were specially created for durability rather than attack power. Meanwhile, most humans simply stayed at a distance, partly because of an internalized gun culture and partly because most of their mystic glyphs involved ranged spells. The response was immediate. It's gravity. Her affinity is gravity. Back on Sol, and in the universe at large, weapons and armor were still widely used, mostly because they were created from Ethereum-infused materials, combined with special crafting methods and the inscribing of runes. That said, even in the universe at large, heavy weapons like Eric's hammer were rare, as most people preferred lighter weapons through which they could channel their magic. But shapeshifters and vampires had their own distinct way of using Ethereum to grow in power. Their method differed from that of humans and every other creature that Eric or Laura knew about. The system Earth's supernatural creatures seemed to follow, focused more on strengthening and enhancing the physical body rather than using Ethereum as a power source for magic spells. Because of that, shapeshifters and vampires had a much higher focus on weapons than humans did. Eric smirked complacently at her comment. I suppose I'm just not like normal humans. A statement that was especially true because he was not a human at all. Regardless, he had decided to fight in human form for now, as changing to his other form would also reveal the particularities of his armor, something that he and Alora figured would bring unwanted attention. That said, it's not like the power of his body entirely disappeared when he was not in his other form. While his werewolf form was definitely his strongest, his human form also received many benefits from his 3 bloodlines and the supernatural power cultivation. Not to mention the boost he received from being merged with Alora's body. Eric lifted his hammer and made it rest on his shoulder as he took a wide stance to complement his wide grin. Let's get started, shall we? Seraphina nodded as deep purple runes began to glow on the exposed parts of her pale skin, providing a beautiful contrast before she charged forward with her large sword at her side. Alora immediately recognized the affinity of this woman and couldn't help but comment on it. Well, isn't that a surprise? First Emily, then Emma, and now this woman? Is it just our luck, or is something else bringing all these rare affinities to us? As Eric watched the woman approach him with incredible speed, he asked, Want to fill me in? Unsure of exactly what abilities his opponent had gained from her gravity affinity, Eric prepared himself for a tough fight. He had already noticed she was much faster than him, especially while he was in his human form. With Seraphina charging at him, he had no time to dodge, and his hammer was still resting over his right shoulder. So instead, he gathered arcs of lightning around his left gauntlet before swiping in the direction of his fast-approaching opponent in an attempt to slow her down. 5 crackling gashes of lightning traveled through the air at immense speed, but Seraphina moved with grace and speed as she nimbly avoided them all. But it did slow her down, giving Eric the time to shift his hammer from its resting position into a more purposeful grip. He adjusted his stance and rotated his body. The hammer slid smoothly down his arm, where he caught it and used the momentum to continue moving into an uppercut swing aimed precisely at the point Seraphina was currently moving towards. Seraphina seemed surprised by Eric's agile handling of the heavy hammer, but reacted quickly. Her body suddenly became lighter as she sidestepped the hammer and swung her sword straight at Eric's side. However, she didn't notice Eric's smirk. The hammer she was currently right next to suddenly began to crackle with lightning before a powerful concussive force blasted her to the side. It wasn't just concussive force, however. Lightning crackled over Seraphina's skin, making her muscles twitch and spasm. Wanting to use this opportunity, Eric once again sent 5 gashes of lightning straight at his now-slowed opponent before he charged straight after them. He would have preferred to charge her down immediately, but in his human form, he needed to use his ranged powers more. And anyway, it's not bad to practice unfamiliar fighting styles now and then, especially in fights that aren't particularly dangerous. Seraphina saw the gashes coming but couldn't dodge them due to her spasming muscles. Instead, she attempted to block them with her weapon. When the gashes impacted her sword, she could feel the power behind them as she slid back with a heavy groan, inwardly thanking her grip for not letting the lightning reach her hands. Affinities with electricity-like attributors were not rare, so it was common practice to wrap a grip in a thin layer of rubber before covering it with leather for comfort. When she came to a halt, her body ached, and the sword she held in front of her had black gashes on it, but she was otherwise unharmed. Meanwhile, Eric used the opportunity to close in on her and immediately swung his heavy hammer in a sideways arc as it once again crackled with lightning. Even in her dazed state, Seraphina recognized the danger. If that hammer hit her, she might not actually survive the day. Eric was aware of this, of course, but despite the intention for the fight to be non-lethal, it's not like either of them would hold back. The rule only meant that they wouldn't deliver the final blow if they had the chance, but currently, they were still right in the middle of it. As the hammer closed in on Seraphina, the runes on her skin suddenly pulsed, and a thin, deep purple coating appeared over her skin. When his heavy weapon connected with this coating, Eric anticipated the familiar resistance of impacting something solid, but instead, he received an almost surreal sensation. It was as if the air itself pushed back against his hammer with unexpected strength. The momentum that should have been transferred from his hammer onto Seraphina was instead abruptly halted, leaving Eric with a feeling of momentary weightlessness. For Eric, there was a jarring disconnect between the anticipated resistance and the actual lack thereof as his muscles suddenly found themselves without a counterforce to brace against. He couldn't help but stumble a little. Using Eric's momentary confusion, Seraphina quickly created some distance between the two of them as the thin layer over her skin disappeared again. She could have used this moment to counterstrike, but she decided against it as her body was still a little shaky from the earlier lightning attack. Now, they once again stood opposite of each other after they both regained their balance. They were both largely unharmed from the clash so far, only having gained some insight into their opponent's powers. Eric looked at her with a questioning gaze, wondering what just happened with his hammer, but she just grinned, clearly not intending to explain her powers to Eric. Alora was a lot more helpful, however, as she quickly gave some explanation. I think that, rather than your hammer impacting her body, or even a shield for that matter, it was countered with an equal and opposite reaction, causing all the momentum to simply disappear. Remembering the science lessons from his youth, Eric mumbled, Newton's third law. Apparently having heard him, Seraphina looked genuinely surprised. Wow, I didn't expect you to get that so fast. Then she smirked, but since you understand, you might as well give up now. Your hammer will never be able to harm me. Alora quickly interjected in Eric's mind. However, she's talking shit. That power definitely costs her a ridiculous amount of energy, especially since she covers her whole body with it for some reason. She offered some suggestions. I suggest switching to the pointy end of your hammer. Since she is apparently forced to cover her entire body in that coating, it might cost her more power when the force is directed into a more concentrated point. Just like the war hammer he left behind on Sol, this one's hammerhead was also divided between a broad, smooth surface on one side and a sharp, piercing tip on the other. Inwardly thanking Alora for her insights, he turned the hammer to make the spike face forward, which caused Serafina to twitch a little with annoyance. Clearly, Alora had been right on the money. Serafina didn't say a word, however, hoping to leave Eric guessing a little longer despite his seemingly high intelligence. They eyed each other for a moment longer before Serafina was once again the first to charge at Eric. She had already noticed she was much faster than him. They started to exchange blows, which mainly consisted of Serafina attacking using her large sword with deceptively fast speed, while Eric skillfully used a combination of his hammer and his armored gauntlets to defend himself. At the same time, he used wide-area attacks to slow the woman down. Since Serafina was much faster but also less durable than him, he needed an opportunity to land a heavy blow, likely defeating her in a single hit. During this time, Eric was the one to receive the most attacks, but his endurance and strength, combined with his armor, left him almost entirely unaffected, causing Serafina to become increasingly frustrated. By now, both of them had figured out their opponent's powers. Since they were both second-rank fighters, they both had two abilities. Eric could launch lightning claws and release concussive lightning blasts from his hammer, while Serafina could alter her body's weight as she wished and project a kind of counterforce field around her body. Yet Serafina had mistakenly assumed that Eric had only a single affinity. After all, Eric had recently gained a brand new bloodline, complete with its own affinity, and had formed his first glyph before even stepping outside the mansion. Once again, having separated and standing across from each other, Serafina and Eric both panted a little, but the one getting nervous was Serafina, as she was running out of energy due to the high cost of her counterforce ability. Since she needed to finish this fast and believed she was now aware of most of Eric's tricks, she lost a lot of her caution when she once again charged at Eric, intending to use her superior speed to try and strike at his unprotected head. After all, she had noticed that his armor was especially tough, and her sword was not sharp enough to cut through it. Eric saw her approach and sent another lightning claw her way, but when he noticed a subtle shift in her stance, betraying her intention to jump over the attack and aim for his head, Eric suddenly grinned. Serafina did not notice his grin, however, as it was hidden behind the lightning gashes heading her way. She followed the plan and jumped over the attack, using gravity to make herself lighter. Now high in the air and fast approaching Eric's head, Serafina believed herself to be safe. She knew neither Eric's hands nor hammer would make it in time to stop her, but as she noticed Eric's wide grin, she got worried. Her worries were confirmed when Eric took a deep breath and opened his mouth wide, before an icy blue magic circle appeared in front of it. She instantly knew she had screwed up. She had no time to activate her counterforce. Instead, she tried to quickly increase her body's weight to get back down to ground, but she was not fast enough. Accompanied by something akin to a wolf's howl, a large blast of icy shrapnel was shot from the magic circle and flew straight at her. She screamed and hid her face behind her arms, but that was all she could do. The shrapnel impacted her body and sent her flying away from Eric, heavily wounded. Seeing he had managed to wound his opponent severely, Eric stowed his hammer behind his back. He considered the fight to be over. His lips had curled into a broad grin, because he had enjoyed the fight quite a bit. Back on Sol, most people he fought were either too weak or focused too much on their powers to really give him the high-stakes, close-quarters combat he longed for. The spectators, or at least the non-enslaved ones, were murmuring among themselves, astonished at the way this fight had gone. No one expected the warden to lose, Not to mention that they had never seen anyone with two affinities before. Eric now decided to go check up on his opponent. The crowd naturally saw this, but no one moved to stop him. They didn't think they would be able to, after all, so they just watched from the side, wondering what this powerful human would do next. Serafina was lying on her back in the grass as blood flowed from a great many cuts on her body, staining the green with red. Her body felt too weak to move from a combination of blood loss, pain, fatigue, and sunlight. While vampires had reduced their vulnerability to sunlight through Ethereum, this did require them to exert a small amount of power during the day to counter it. Right now, however, she had overtaxed herself in using her counterforce ability too much, not to mention that it had been too long since she last drank blood, as she had been in too much of a hurry to get here. Unlike their weakness to sunlight, their reliance on blood was still a powerful weakness for them. They required regular blood consumption to survive, keep their supernatural regeneration active, and prevent gullification. While shapeshifters had constant access to regeneration, vampires faced more drawbacks, making them less advantageous overall. Shapeshifters, in comparison, had minimal weaknesses, with Ethereum significantly reducing their vulnerability to wolfsbane. The only hindrance they faced was the need to transform to unleash their full physical prowess, a process typically taking no more than a second or two. The biggest drawback to this was the ruined clothes they had to deal with every time. On the other hand, vampires depended on blood for sustenance and had to exert a small amount of power during the day to counter sunlight weakness. The only distinct advantages they possessed were an extended lifespan and continued access to their full physical abilities, assuming they had recently consumed enough blood. Meanwhile, shapeshifters' diminishing transformation times as their power increased meant that even this advantage was gradually fading away. Even the touted immortality of vampires wasn't accurate. The oldest vampire Serafina knew was merely around 200 years old. In Serafina's case, the sunlight weakness was worsened because the icy shards that had wounded her had also ripped her clothes, exposing most of her body to the open air. Vampires like to wear tight-fitting black clothes covering most of the body to reduce the effect of sunlight as much as possible. After all, if it was absorbed by their clothes, it wouldn't be absorbed by their skin. Other colors would just reflect the sunlight, which might as well hit their uncovered body parts. To be fair, though, these clothes are mostly a leftover from before the awakening. Serafina could only count her lucky stars that it was a cloudy day, or she might not even be able to open her eyes now that she couldn't protect herself with Ethereum. Luckily, only Eric could really enjoy her exposed skin, as the crowd was too far away and couldn't look down at her from above. Appreciating the view of Serafina's gorgeous and well-endowed body despite the blood, Eric wore a lustful grin as he crouched next to her prone body. That was a good fight. You are quite skilled with that sword, as well as your abilities. I'm impressed. While he would have won much more easily if he could use his full abilities, Eric was still impressed by this woman's fighting ability. The fact was, she simply didn't have many of his advantages. For example, if it weren't for his armor, he would at least have some wounds. He would still have one, just not entirely unscathed. Continuing to enjoy the view of his defeated foe's mostly naked body, he decided to introduce himself. My name is Eric Gunulf, by the way. I make it a point to tell a woman my name after I've seen her naked. It's just good manners, you know. Serafina did her best to stifle her pain groans as she stared at the sky in an attempt to ignore Eric. She hated her current vulnerability. She wouldn't die from her wounds, but she wouldn't be able to get up anytime soon, either. Not while it was day, and she didn't have blood to drink. She closed her eyes as anger over her own failure flowed through her mind. Anger at her current weakness, anger at losing, anger at not anticipating every possibility, and at becoming hasty near the end. She knew some people had two affinities, but it was still too rare for her to have considered the possibility during the fight. Eric wasn't unique with his multiple affinities, as sometimes people were just born with them, and although that wasn't the only way to have more than one, other methods likely weren't available to Earth for now. Seeing that the woman was uninterested in talking to him and prepared to stare at the sky in annoyed defiance, Eric kept talking, So, are you just going to keep lying there? He was perfectly aware of her current difficulties, but he couldn't help but try to rile her up a little. This time, Serafina responded, fuck you. Eric chuckled. Maybe later. As Serafina rolled her eyes at him, he continued, anyway, would you like some help? Serafina was undoubtedly surprised by his offer as her eyes opened, and she looked at him with suspicion and wariness. Why? You already got what you wanted. Despite her words, the truth was that she really could use some help. She had been far too hasty by rushing into this duel. She had no subordinates or blood supply present, because she had traveled ahead of her companions when she heard what Liam had done. So now, she would be forced to lay here and slowly recover until they arrived, assuming no one messed with her. She certainly didn't trust the subordinates of that toad Liam, but was Eric any better? The man in question shrugged. I respect you as a fighter. You and I have no hatred between us, so leaving you out here to bleed out on the grass is not my style. Besides, I need some information, and you are the perfect candidate to provide it. Neither Emily nor her slaves really knew much about the event from the last 7 years, since the slaves were too weak to know much, and Emily mostly stayed holed up on the Ashcroft estate. Hence, Eric and Alora needed another source of information. Serafina grumbled for a while, but didn't respond. Seeing she needed some more incentive, Eric decided to poke at her honor. She seemed like the kind of person to have such a thing. Well, if you're unwilling to follow through on your word, then what else can I do? This statement triggered her as she growled. What the hell are you talking about? Go grab Liam. You won. Eric chuckled as she responded exactly how he wanted her to. Actually, the deal was the winner would get to decide how this ends. And I don't want it to end with you bleeding out on Emily's lawn. Serafina perked up a little. Perhaps she only needed a valid excuse to let herself be helped. However, she still hesitated before suddenly making a demand of her own. I want to meet Emily and Emma. You help me, and let me meet them, and I'll tell you whatever you want within reason. Eric's eyes shone with interest. After all, he and Alora had not found anything about Serafina in Emily's memories. So you really do know them? Huh? Anyway, why does it sound like you're doing me a favor? Clearly intent on doing whatever she could to appear in control, she quickly answered while suppressing her own pained groans with clenched teeth, take it or leave it. Eric could see the determination in her eyes. She was ready to be left there if Eric didn't give her some dignity in defeat. So he chuckled in resignation. Fine. But before I help you, I want your name. It's not like he minded if she met with the sisters. In fact, if Serafina had a positive history with him, his actions so far might increase his standing in her eyes, which could be helpful in the future as he was trying to bind this woman to his side. She looked at him with a little exasperation. Was he trying to be her friend or something? Regardless, she saw no problem with it, Serafina Nightshade. Eric couldn't help but laugh at her name, which caused Serafina to blush as she growled. What? He shrugged. I don't know, it's just such a typical vampire name. Did your parents pick it from some trashy vampire novel? Seeing her withering stare, Eric chuckled and decided to drop the matter before suddenly grinning and extending his hand while dark green energy swirled over his arm towards it. Regardless, let's shake on our new deal, Serafina. Seeing her have a much calmer reaction than Emma did, Eric smiled. This woman was truly a fighter. This is covenant magic. Think of it as a magic contract. We both agree to the terms, and the magic ensures we keep our end of the bargain. When the magic reached his wrist, he grabbed Serafina's hand, as she didn't have the power to lift it currently, and said, The deal is this, he began. I will help you recover and meet with the Ashcroft sisters, and in exchange, you will truthfully answer all my questions to the best of your ability, so long as they don't reveal anything that could put you in danger. Then he added a little something that he and Alora put at the end of most of their covenants. Furthermore, you are not allowed to reveal anything about me to your council or anyone else besides what all these people around us already know. Serafina looked at the dark green energy with concern, as she had never heard of this covenant magic. Still, since she wanted this deal and didn't hear anything wrong with it, she nodded her head, agreed. After the covenant was formed, they both gained the symbol of a wolf's head with 2 fairy wings on the back of their hands, with Eric having 2 now, although Serafina couldn't see this yet. Seeing how the deal was made, Eric nodded. Good. And then suddenly bit his finger, causing blood to flow before he moved it towards Seraphina's mouth with a dominant smirk. As the finger approached, Seraphina seemed a bit panicked, stammering, wait, I... However, it was too late. Eric pushed his finger in her mouth, and she instantly experienced the most heavenly taste of blood she ever had. Eric had discussed this with Alora earlier. Due to his powerful bloodlines, Alora suspected Eric's blood might be both delicious and very beneficial for vampires. That wasn't enough, though, as she had also purposefully introduced a somewhat addicting element to Eric's blood after discussing it with him. While Eric generally tried to be Alora's moral compass, he could also see the benefit of making a high-ranking council subordinate a little dependent on him. After all, after he had gotten his revenge on Edda, there were still plenty of other things to do on Earth, and having someone like Seraphina on his side would only be beneficial. Having Eric's finger in her mouth, Seraphina found herself unable to stop drinking his blood. It not only tasted heavenly, but she could also feel the power brimming inside as it filled her body from head to toe. While this made Eric lose blood relatively fast, his body could recover it at similar speeds, especially with Alora helping out. Meanwhile, Eric felt both his lust and his sense of domination rise as he looked at Seraphina, sucking on his finger with desperation. At moments like these, he realized how much of a corrupting effect Alora had on him. But he didn't mind so much. After all, he did genuinely love Alora, personality and all. Besides, lust and a desire to dominate were hardly the worst qualities he could have, so long as he could hold fast to his core moral beliefs. Not to mention that it felt good. His eyes were drawn towards the vampire's rapidly healing wounds. He knew their regeneration was always faster while they were drinking blood, but this speed was much higher than even that, likely due to the power in Eric's blood. When Seraphina's wounds had healed, Eric pulled his finger out of her mouth, causing Seraphina to try and follow it with a greedy look in her eyes, but Eric quickly pushed her back down until the wound on his finger had healed. Seraphina growled as she tried to use her fangs to bite him, her eyes lost in feral hunger, but she found herself unable to escape from Eric's strength. It took her a few moments to calm down before she sagged back onto the ground and panted, What are you? Your blood and your physical ability. You are no normal human. While she had somewhat realized his weirdly powerful physical body during their fight, his overall strangeness only really began to sink in now that she had also tasted his blood and her mind wasn't so damn exhausted anymore. Eric smirked at her realization. That's true, but it doesn't really matter anymore, does it? The Covenant will prevent you from talking about it to anyone. Still smirking, he extended his hand to her. Need some help getting up? But Seraphina snorted and ignored his hand as she stood up with inborn grace. We'll see how strong this magic of yours is and whether it will actually prevent me from talking to anyone about you. But regardless, I can still try to satisfy my own curiosity. After standing and dusting of her body, she continued, Anyway, since your so-called covenant is supposed to compel you to let me meet Emily and Emma, why don't we get to it? But Eric smiled mischievously at her. Actually, the wording of these covenants is crucial, you know? Since no time period was set for meeting the two of them, I can basically do it whenever I like. Seraphina's eyes flared with anger as she reached for her sword. You? Eric laughed at her useless anger. What are you going to do with that sword? We already know how that story ends. And I didn't even use my full power during our battle. Her hand paused as she looked at him suspiciously. You're lying. But Eric smirked confidently. No, I'm not. And you have already tasted the proof. I know the amazing taste must have overwhelmed you a little, but surely you could still taste the difference between a human and a shapeshifter. Eric didn't mind revealing this now. He had complete confidence in Alora's covenants. Plus, this would create more interest towards him from Seraphina as she tried to figure him out. Seraphina fell into stunned silence as she slowly examined the heavenly taste from earlier, but discovered that, indeed, he was telling the truth. Continuing with her stunned silence, she just stared at Eric with a mixture of anger, curiosity, and wariness. Seeing he had awakened sufficient interest in her mind, Eric decided to move on. Anyway, how about you get the trash off my lawn and get Liam here? I'll also have all the slaves released from their bonds, so you'll probably have to deal with that as well. Afterwards, I will let you meet the sisters as promised. Serafina looked at him with surprise. I thought you were going to make me wait. Eric shook his head with a smile. Why would I do that? I will only stay here for a few more days at most, and I have no interest in having a covenant tied to me for much longer than that. Eric and Alora were always careful to make covenant effects on them last as briefly as possible. For example, their covenant with Emma would lose its effect on them after they had cured Emily, but Emma would be forever affected. After all, part of the deal was for her to never talk about Eric and Alora with anyone without their permission, causing her to be forever connected to them. The same now counted for Serafina. Alora and Eric would be freed from the conditions as soon as they had shown her the two Ashcroft sisters. At the same time, Serafina would not only be forever restricted from revealing information about Eric and Alora, but also be forced to answer their questions. That is, unless either of them gains the power to overwhelm Alora's covenant, but they would need to be at least fourth rankers for that. Serafina felt relieved at Eric's intention not to make her wait. She even felt a bit of gratitude build inside her. Yet, another problem remained. What about my clothes? It's hard to make people obey you when you're half naked. Eric's lips curled up in a lustful grin. That depends on the person you're trying to command. I find a lot of women become much more agreeable when I'm naked. Seeing Serafina was not amused, he rolled his eyes at her lack of humor before he snapped his finger, and Serafina's torn clothes suddenly stitched themselves back together under her astonished gaze. Naturally, it was Alora doing this, as the uses of cedar magic were truly varied. Serafina looked at him with more wariness and confusion, but Eric just shrugged and shooed her with his hand while smirking a little, clearly not intending to answer her questions. She quickly walked away to do as Eric had asked of her, without even realizing she was already following his orders as if it were normal. Perhaps part of the problem was that she couldn't get the taste of his blood out of her mind, as she unconsciously kept rolling her tongue around her mouth to try and find any remaining drops. So many things had happened in the last 2 days, and he barely had time to let his mind catch up to it all. Sometimes, it seemed like every moment here on Earth only created more questions while the answers seemed further and further out of reach. While he could be considered happy about the chance to get revenge on Etta, his life had suddenly become a lot more complicated. Things were much easier on Sol. All he and Alora had to worry about was the next job. Sure, Alora had many ambitions and plans, so tougher times were always on the horizon, but that was supposed to be only after they had significantly grown in strength. Sensing his slight turmoil and knowing all the trash and the surroundings had already left the area, Alora appeared in her larger form and laid down on his chest in a comforting hug. They were currently in the Ashcroft Mansion living room, the same place where Emily and Emma had once seen their parents combust. Emily was also there, or at least her body was, as she stood next to the couches with the same doll-eyed stare she'd had since Alora locked her mind away. The fourth person in the room was a black-haired, pasty-looking man, tied up in a hog tie with a gag in his mouth, having been dumped in the corner while squirming from left to right in outrage, but going wholly ignored. After Serafina had left Eric on the grass, she had first gone to secure Liam by tying him up in the way he currently was, during the process of which he had woken up from the kick Serafina had given him earlier. Next, she organized the released slaves, ensuring Liam's subordinates took good care of them for potential council propaganda. Lastly, she instructed the gathered men and women to leave, assuring them she would handle the rest and indicating that Liam likely wouldn't return. Though there was some grumbling, they ultimately followed her instructions. Their loyalty to Liam wasn't strong enough to challenge the woman who was just before effortlessly shrugging off mighty hammer blows like they were nothing, especially because she now appeared to be backed by both the man who defeated her and the Witch of London. Instead, they decided it was wiser to focus on gaining support to become the region's next leader. Eric lounged on a couch across from the two women as he responded to Serafina's question with a confident smirk. We'll get to that. How about you tell me what your history with Emily is first? Seraphina's already red eyes were nearly spitting fire as she was about ready to get into another fight with this man. But instead, she felt something inside force an answer out of her. I lived in London before the world went to shit. In fact, my family were neighbors to the Ashcrofts. With annoyance and confusion in her eyes, the words kept flowing out of her. Emily and I became quick friends because we both liked rock music and hung out with the same crowds. She never found out about what I was, of course. Her strained expression worsened. In fact, my family lived here under a false name, and I always wore wigs and lenses and a lot of makeup to hide my nature as a vampire from hunters. But her face went red as she tried to keep this bit of information inside. But the Covenant was ruthless. We experimented a little with each other as well, though we never went very far. In a corner, Liam went bug-eyed at that piece of information. When he was still secretly scheming to take Emily into his bed, he had kept any guys away from her with a combination of threats and money, but he never would have thought to do the same with women. Meanwhile, Alora and Eric finally understood why they hadn't found any evidence of Seraphina's existence in Emily's memories. Because, in a sense, she didn't exist back then. Eric snickered at Seraphina's red face as he waved his hand. All right. No need to strain yourself. I get the picture. You two were close. So why leave her behind when the world went to shit? The back of Eric's hand had now lost one of the Covenant marks, as he had fulfilled his part of the bargain by letting Seraphina meet Emily. How far he would take things from here was up to him, but Seraphina would continue to be bound by the Covenant for a long time. Seraphina stared at Eric for a moment longer, her eyes burning with fury. She deeply regretted her rash decision to accept Eric's deal without thinking some more about the wording. Technically, she could still answer him while trying to stab his face, but she knew that would accomplish little. So she sighed in resignation and answered before the Covenant would make her do it anyway. My father forced me, she explained. When the awakening came, we fled to Eastern Europe, where our family's ancestral home was located, intending to find safety in numbers. She frowned thoughtfully. The whole thing went down as if he had a plan ready for when this moment came, like he knew it would happen. But he never confirmed those thoughts. Then she sighed helplessly. I resented him for that for a long time, and still do a little, but I eventually just accepted that Emily and her adorable little sister were already dead. But then, the council formed, and I heard rumors about a witch of London named Emily living in the Ashcroft estate. So, here I am, she finally shrugged. Now, before you ask anything else, will you please tell me what's wrong with her? Deciding to have a little mercy on Seraphina. Eric shrugged. Surely you've heard about the things Emily got up to here? I mean, there's a reason the council sent you, right? Seraphina looked a little uncomfortable as she indeed had a hard time linking the enslavement of so many people to the determined and no-nonsense, yet inherently kind girl she knew in the past. So she nodded, yeah, but such is the price for safety, I get that. Eric shook his head. No, it went much deeper than that. Have you and your council never noticed behavioral changes in people with certain affinities? Seraphina furrowed her brows in thought before she nodded. Yeah, there's been theories. Are you saying they're correct? Seeing Eric nod, Seraphina's face scrunched up and she looked back at Emily with pity and sadness. Based on the information we have, it's always been assumed Emily has a darkness affinity. I'm guessing that's bad. Eric answered, worst of the worst. The Emily you knew is basically gone. I currently have her mind entirely locked down, but if I freed her right now, she would either try to kill or enslave us both without much thought. Seraphina looked at Emily for a little longer, as if lost in memories, before she turned back to Eric with suspicion in her eyes. Do you have any proof of that? With his lips curled into a smirk, Eric said, is there any proof you would believe? Since I can lock Emily's mind away, what's to say I can't make her do and say whatever I like? Regardless, I have no reason to prove myself to you anyway. You can believe my words or not. It makes no difference to me. Seraphina realized he was right. She had no way to force him into giving her any kind of proof. She could either believe or disbelieve, but it was undeniable that the council had data on personality changes based on affinities. Seeing her lost expression, Eric offered a compromise, since his aim was still to make this woman look favorably upon him, so that her dependence would increase. But perhaps talking to Emma will paint you a picture of Emily's changes over the past 7 years. You should have seen the state I found her in when I arrived here yesterday. Still lounging on the couch, he looked past Serafina and to the door. "Would you like to come in, Emma?" He had noticed her arrival soon after he sat down here. Serafina probably would have as well if she hadn't been preoccupied with Emily. In surprise, Serafina looked at the doorway and found a pitiful-looking girl who resembled the young Emma she had once known. Emma, meanwhile, looked into the room with trepidation. This was the first time she was so close to setting foot inside the living room once again since she had witnessed her parents' fate there. She wasn't deterred, however. While the last 7 years had severely eroded her mental resilience, her inherent personality was one of optimism and adaptability, which, combined with her rapidly growing trust in Eric, caused her mental resilience to rise at a fast pace. Was this really all due to Emily, then? Before she could find the right words or person to blame, Emma suddenly stepped into the room and gave Serafina a warm and cute hug, much like the one she had given in the past, to drive away her big sister's sorrows. Clearly, hearing Serafina's story made Emma realize who she was, and the hug indicated it was good to see her again. She even called Serafina by the fake name she had used in the past. "It's good to see you again, Olivia." Yet, Eric realized he was right when he thought Emma might, inherently, not be much of a talker when she didn't say anything else before letting go of Serafina and sitting down next to Eric. Despite her bravery in entering this room, she couldn't help but let overflowing sadness seep into her eyes as she constantly glanced between her sister Emily and the space where her parents' funeral sofa had once stood. Serafina looked at the clearly exhausted and underfed Emily, who was glancing sadly around the room and starting to understand what Emily might have been like the last 7 years. When he saw Emma looking sad, Eric put an arm around her in an attempt to comfort her, as he still felt a little protective towards her. Emma seemed shocked at his actions, but offered no resistance and even smiled a little, at least for a moment, as her close proximity to Eric caused the scenes from this morning to suddenly spring into her mind, making her smile strain a little as her cheeks heated up. Seeing Emma like this caused Serafina quite a bit of surprise, as she was under the impression that Eric had only met her yesterday. She wondered if he had made such a good impression on the girl, or if something else was happening. Suspicions rose again as she wondered if he had done something to her mind, since he obviously had the capability, considering Emily's state. In fact, there really was something else going on, something that only Alora and Eric were currently aware of, but Emma would only find out when she awakened. Having calmed down a little, Emma looked at Eric with a questioning gaze as she pointed at Emily. "Can we get started yet?" But Eric shook his head. "My partner is currently laying the groundwork, but we can't get started in earnest yet. We need to get you to awaken first, but your body is still far too weak for that, and it's not getting any better by not sleeping. I don't know why you look even more exhausted than yesterday, but you must get enough sleep." Although Eric had given Emma some Ethereum-infused food yesterday, that was not enough to resolve the issue in a day. And, combined with her fatigue, there was just no way they could awaken her today. Emma looked confused at Eric. Why do I need to awaken first?" Eric's lips curled into a comforting smile. "Because your affinity is uniquely suited to help your sister. Hopefully, this will also help a little with your guilt." Emma looked partly confused and partly happy, but then seemed to fall into thought, likely thinking about her sleeping troubles, whatever they were. Leaving her to her thoughts while petting her head, Eric turned his attention back to Serafina. "You can have a reunion with Emma later if you like. For now, I need you to answer more of my questions." So far, Serafina had just been looking at Emma with pain in her heart, as she could still remember the cheerful little girl from back before the awakening. Yet, Eric's words pulled her out of her thoughts as he looked at him with somewhat kinder eyes, yet ignoring his words. "Can you really help Emily?" Eric shrugged, sort of. "It will be more like me helping Emma to help Emily." He then pointed to Liam. "The pasty shit over there will help out too, since he was the main source of Emily's paranoia and isolationist attitude the last 7 years. We'll let her work out some of her darkness on him." Serafina suddenly looked both confused and surprised. That's why you wanted him? But why would he be the main source of her dark emotions? Sure, they ended up on opposite sides, but her parents were friends with him, weren't they? Eric raised an eyebrow in curiosity. I see. I suppose I shouldn't be surprised you didn't know. He looked to this side. Emma, do you mind if I tell her? Emma, roused from her thoughts, looked a little uncomfortable, but then nodded. So Eric told Serafina everything that happened to the sisters from the day of the awakening, causing anger to quickly rise in Serafina's eyes until she was seething with fury. Rat bastard, she exclaimed, ready to stomp the cornered and tied up, squirming man into the floor. But Eric stopped her. Calm down, he soothed with a raised hand. I understand your anger, but it is not your place to take revenge. Remember, he is important to Emily's recovery. Don't worry, though. I'm sure Emily will make him suffer when the time comes. Still seething but seemingly calmed by Eric's promise of future suffering, she returned to her place next to Emily before taking a deep breath. While some gratitude tried its best to shine through in Serafina's eyes, it was still primarily suspicion as she eyed Eric. Why are you helping them? You don't really seem like the good Samaritan type. Contrary to her expectations, Eric looked sad as he said, It's hard not to be moved by the story of these two sisters. Then his expression turned into a smirk. But you're right. I do get something out of it, of course. But you don't need to worry about that. Emma is fully aware of the deal she made. Now about those questions. Serafina felt a little better upon seeing his genuine sadness over the sisters' story, but still wished to know the details of their deal as she noticed the same mark she had on Emma's hand. Yet, she knew she wouldn't get any further by asking Eric, so she determined to ask Emma later and instead just nodded at Eric. Ask away. Eric started looking serious as he leaned forward a little. Good. First of all, assume I've been living under a rock for the past 7 years and tell me everything that's happened in that time. Serafina was a little surprised at his request, but decided not to think too much about it as she began talking. It was currently the year 2030, and on the day of the awakening 7 years ago, spontaneous combustion claimed 70% of humanity, while leaving the survivors with newfound magical abilities. This event coincided with the emergence of supernaturals, including shapeshifters and vampires, which added to the challenges faced by everyone as humans were suddenly faced with creatures from horror movies. Even animals mutated, gaining strength, some intelligence, and occasionally elemental manipulation skills. Amidst this turmoil, powerful individuals who, surprisingly, had already made some headway in the awakened powers rose to prominence, becoming rulers and instigating conflicts among themselves. Naturally, chaos reigned supreme during this first year, as every race fought not only each other, but also among themselves. The initial reliance on guns dwindled over the years as bullets became scarce, pushing people towards harnessing and enhancing their magical capabilities. Communication methods face challenges due to Ethereum interfering with specific communication frequencies, limiting effective ranges to a mere 100 kilometers. Both laser and radio wave-based communication struggled, and even sea cables were eventually severed through unknown means. The chaos of the early years hampered attempts to restore communication infrastructure. However, they were still able to gather some information from nearby continents. In Africa, the land became a battleground ruled by various warlords engaged in constant conflict. Asia, on the other hand, had witnessed the rise of human supremacist dictatorship, where supernaturals faced enslavement or death. Meanwhile, the Americas and Australia situations remained uncertain, prompting the Council to plan expeditions to explore these continents. In Europe, initial racial tensions led to territories dominated by a single race. However, efforts by the Council aimed to reintegrate the races and restore a semblance of unity. Despite these attempts, Europe remained divided into factions, presenting a volatile mix of races waiting for resolution. The Council's exploration missions became crucial in unveiling the fates of other continents and determining the path forward for the awakened world. After Serafina was done talking, Eric remained silent for a while as he and Alora internalized all this new information, while Emma actually did the same, as she also had very little information about the world's current state.